Hey everybody, and welcome back to the Game Nexus. It's Dwayne here, and today we're going to be talking about how to take your Dungeons & Dragons combat sessions to the next level. So when we talk about Dungeons & Dragons, we often bring up the topic of how combat plays an important role in your games. Now, I'm of the mind that Dungeons & Dragons does need conflict in every kind of encounter or session that you run, but it doesn't necessarily have to be combat. However, once combat is afoot, it's important to give it that extra special touch that it needs to really bring it alive in players' minds. Now, I'm of two minds of playing Dungeons & Dragons. Throughout my entire life playing D&D, for the most part, I have been a Theater of the Mind Dungeon Master. I started off playing Theater of the Mind, and I didn't really know any other way to play D&D. Being in the 80s, there wasn't a large selection of tabletop miniatures, terrain. That concept of D&D was kind of very vague in the sense that the rules didn't really focus on that aspect of D&D, the combat being very kind of fluid. Now I know Gary Gygax originally built the Dungeons & Dragons around miniature combat or tabletop combat per se in the chainmail rules. But once I started learning D&D, I kind of used my imagination to flesh out the combat sequences in the game. What I did notice early on, though, is that sometimes it was difficult for my players to get a sense of where and what was happening. So I really had to double down on my efforts to make sure I made everything as clear as possible. And I continued on that path, avoiding the aspect of figures, miniatures, things like that for the longest time in my D&D games. I'll tell you a story of why. There was a game in the 80s called Marvel Superheroes role-playing game, and it's another game that TSR made around that time, taking the Marvel license. And when I bought that game came included with cardstock miniatures, or tokens as you were, and a map. And the rules actually were very precise in how you ran combat, right down to how far somebody could move, what the range of certain things were. So it was kind of like a miniature, it was a miniature game with role-playing rules. And I very quickly found that using that was fun, but once I started doing a deep dive into using miniatures like that, I stopped actually describing combat. It just sort of became a secondary thing. So I went from in Dungeons & Dragons to explaining every sword swing, how the characters moved across the battlefield, and then playing Marvel where I just moved things and just rolled dice. And my players as well did the same thing. We didn't really get caught up in the dramatic descriptions. So I think that's one of the reasons why I've resisted using miniatures in D&D for so long. It wasn't until probably 5th edition, I would say, that I really embraced the use of tabletop miniatures in my games. And it probably had something to do with the fact that I became an avid tabletop wargamer during those years as well, jumping into Warhammer and all the other tabletop games. Now, most recently, Star Wars Legion, Marvel Crisis Protocol, just you name it. There's a whole slew of miniature games. So I'm a lot more comfortable in using miniatures on the tabletop. Now that I do terrain building as well, it becomes natural to create these environments for my players to play in. It's a lot of work, mind you, creating terrain and stuff, but it is fun and I enjoy it. However, what I'm going to talk about today is specifically how not to lose sight of the fact that you are describing combat, or you should be describing your combat, making your combat come alive. And I'm going to give you some tips on things that you can do and some of the things that I do in my games to ensure that your players are still visualizing your D&D combat, even though you might be playing it out on a table with squares or hexes or however you do your D&D combat. So let's start off first by talking about descriptions. So me as a kid growing up, I was very big into movies and comic books, cartoons, things like that. So I think growing into an adult, I started to view my games through a very cinematic lens. And what I mean by that is, even to this day, when I'm playing miniature games, yes, I'm moving figures around the table, but for me, I imagine what that looks like on a movie scene or a cartoon. So yes, moving this figure here to here, rolling dice to do a punch, it just immediately triggers an automatic response for me in my mind. I see that playing out. So I'm blessed in that sense, in that I do view my games through that lens, but not everybody might have that. So it's important to note, try and focus on what's happening and then the explanation to go with it. So if your players decide to move, let's just use move as an example. Yes, they move 6 squares, and you move that miniature across the table to where they want to be. You could leave it at that and allow the players to imagine that, but you can't go on the assumption that they are imagining that. So what you can do is just take that simple action and in your mind go, how are they moving? Yes, they're doing a walking speed or a sprint or a dash in game terms, but what does that look like? Try and pause for a minute and in your mind, look, what would that look like in a movie set or a TV show or a cartoon or a panel of a comic book? Use some descriptives, some adjectives. Say, you sprint or you hurriedly walk. If you want to get even more dramatic with it, start using some of the terrain features. What would it look like if you went running through snow or grass? You could even say things like the mud kicks up from behind your feet as you sprint to reach your opponent. Throw away lines like that, just small little things. It'll trigger an imagination reflex in your players, hopefully. And it goes from just simply moving your figure to having a dramatic look in their visual mind. So hopefully that's something there. So let's just talk about engaging in combat. Combat really at the core of it is just rolling dice and making sure you're in the right range, and then you roll damage. There's a lot there that's really meaty that you can bite into. So even the sense of rolling to hit gives you enough descriptive potential. The one thing you want to avoid, however, is a lot of younger players and even older players will like to go into elaborate descriptions on how their character attacks. And depending on how you run your games, I prefer that the players don't describe their attacks, because a lot of the times it leads to arguments about how they could fail. So give you an example. In my early days as a young D&D player, my players might say something like, Dwayne, I run up and I stab him in the face. That's pretty gross. But an example. And so they would give me this dramatic description of what they do. I jump through the air and I do a triple somersault through the air and I land and I stab them. And then they would roll and they would miss. So they have this dramatic thing, and then they start saying, well, where do I miss? How do I miss? At what point do I miss? Do I roll through the air? So one thing that you can do is you can say to your players, look, I'm going to allow you to roll. If you successfully roll, the value of that roll dictates how awesome your move was, making sure that you stay within the parameters of the game rules. So if that said player wanted to do something dramatic like somersault through the air or what have you, let him roll. If he rolls a miss, then you can describe the miss for him, or he can describe the miss. If he rolls a nat 20, give him the table and say, you know what, the camera is yours. Let you frame it how you think that would have happened, staying within the rules of plausibility and the game rules. Triple somersault flips through the air, probably not going to happen, but allow that player to have that opportunity. And if he can't, and if he's not an imaginative player, then go ahead and you fill that in for him. Allow the dice to guide the result as far as the actual, attack attempt. Likewise, on the damage side of things, if a player actually does hit with a great damage dice roll, allow them, keeping in mind that sometimes players like to be a little gory, and also they don't know the monsters or opponents' hit points. So for them to say, I jump through the air, do a triple somersault, and stab them in the eye, well, we know that that's pretty much death for any kind of creature or human, right? But if that only did 2 hit points of damage, you got to frame it properly. So a 2 hit points of damage would be a nick, or would be just a slight wound, right? Whereas, 15 points of damage, even if it's on a large creature with lots of hit points, is a pretty substantial wound, right? Like it's normally a death-dealing blow to an average creature. So framing it within the damage that you're doing and allowing that player first chance, and if they can't, then you use your imagination to come up with a suitable result. The important thing in all this is that you're engaging the player with description. We don't want the game to boil down to just rolling dice to hit, rolling dice for damage. And As funny as it sounds, those were my early days of dungeon mastering. It was quite literally, if you imagine it, two creatures standing beside each other, two players and a creature or whatever it is, and basically just hitting each other and alternating, taking turns hitting each other. And it was quite a funny thing to think of, but without those descriptions, the players don't have the context. They don't understand what that battlefield is looking like. So that's important to do, and using the dice as your guideline can actually help you with that as well. So we're going to talk about another aspect of describing your combat that I think often gets overlooked in actual fact, and I think a lot of the times dungeon masters are kind of leery to go out this far on a limb to actually flesh out their combat, and that's environmental. So if we've watched any great sword fight in any kind of movie or any kind of conflict in any movie, TV series, cartoon, the environment plays a big role in it. And I think often in Dungeons and Dragons, dungeon masters are afraid to involve the environment because of whether it be game breaking or in actual fact, there might not be any rules for it, right? So in sticking close to the rules, very rarely do we see situations where heroes are jumping over tables, falling against barrels, getting knocked into a tree. So one of the things I do in my games is part of my descriptions, I don't treat it as a side rule, is part of my descriptions include the terrain. So if a player is engaged in combat, and let's just say something simple as a sword fight, and he's fighting somebody, take the environment they're in. Are they in a kitchen? Are they in a room? Are they outside? Are they in a cave? Engage that and roll that into your results. So let's just take, for example, a miss. The player runs at the hobgoblin with his sword, and he rolls a 5, and he misses. So right there is an opportunity as a dungeon master to say, well, how did he miss? What's going on that would cause him to miss? Well, we know that the armor class of a creature and a player is made up of physical armor, and we know that it's made up of dexterity, which is the ability to dodge or evade an attack. But there's no real rule that says, hey, that stone got in the way, or I tripped, therefore he gets a trip bonus to his armor class. There's no real set guidelines for that, but a miss is a miss. So you as a dungeon master have the option of saying, you know what, you hit his armor and his armor class protected him. So one description option would be you swung your sword and the hobgoblin held up his shield and deflected your blow. Great. The player actually now has a sense of what's going on. Better yet, you roll and you miss, the hobgoblin evades your sword strike. He ducks out of the way, just narrowly getting his hair chopped off or his ponytail clipped as you swing your sword through the air. Okay. Further now is environmental. Yes, you rolled a miss, but maybe you tripped. Maybe you're in this cave environment and you go charging towards the creature, you take a step forward and you slip on some loose gravel and it causes you to stumble. Okay? Going even further, maybe you stumble forward and bang your shoulder into the rock wall. And you're probably thinking right now, going, whoa, wait a minute, Dwayne. What does that mean? Does that mean that your character is are you unbalancing the combat because now he missed, but now he's missed and something bad? That's okay. You are the dungeon master. In that situation, I would probably say no. There's no penalty. You just it's flavor. You stumble and you bump into the rock wall. Not enough to hurt you. Not enough to give you disadvantage, but it did trigger a descriptive, imaginatory reflex in your player now, and they get a sense of the combat. Doing anything you can to provide the player with more of an imagination of what's going on. So let's talk about hits and stuff, for example. In combat, we often forget that these weapons aren't indestructible and such, and they don't really have a rule set for saying weapons can break or armor can break and such. So this is where you can go a little bit above and beyond with your games and add that in if you want. So I wouldn't necessarily arbitrarily do it with the players. The heroes are very protective of their gear, and you don't want to just arbitrarily start breaking stuff on them. If it suits your narrative, for sure. But you know what? Monsters are fair game, and not that it's going to give them an advantage or anything like that, but it's okay to say, you know what? In this cave example, the hobgoblin charges at you in return. He rolls, and you get a miss. You can say to the player, you know what, you dodge out of the way, and he slams his sword down on the rock that you just bumped into, fracturing his sword in half or snapping his sword in half. He's now wielding a smaller blade, which is broken at the tip. Wow, you've just engaged the imagination of the player. I could go on and describe lots of different scenarios, but the gist of it is including environmental descriptions as well as trying to frame the results of the roles in the form of a description is really going to add a lot to your games. And I don't think players necessarily are going to mind, especially if you wanted to throw in some dramatic stuff like falls, trips, that kind of stuff, even giving disadvantages. I've never had players come back to me and say, Dwayne, the rulebook says that's not a thing. You are the dungeon master. You create your own rules as you go. And as long as you're not being unfair in any respect, I don't think the players would mind. Lots of different environments, lots of things could happen. And at the end of the day, we're here to make the game enjoyable for the players. Those are my tips on running some really engaging D&D combat. If you have some ideas of your own or even just things that you've done in your games that really spice up the proceedings, definitely leave some comments. I'd love to see what you're doing. I know it can get really challenging at times in the heat of dice rolling to keep adding in these descriptions, but my advice is just to slow the combat down a little bit and give the players breathing room to really imagine the environment and even pause once in a while and describe what's going on without a die roll behind it. Just simply say, I want you guys to imagine, or pause for a second, close your eyes, and I want you to imagine what this looks like. Giving the player permission to visualize and telling them it's okay. We don't have to be rolling dice every 3 seconds to play D&D. It's okay to just let your imagination take over. So if those have been useful for you, great. I appreciate you guys tuning in, and make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you can keep up to date on all my new content. And have a great day.